Technology Solutions. I am joined with Steve Reese from Reese Legal, was where we're going with this one, right? Remind me your law
Re-
firm's full name.
Close. Reese Law Firm.
Reese Law Firm. In your email, that's what I'm thinking of. I
Yes.
got that. Yeah, see, you confused me a little bit. Steve, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Logan. As you said, my name is Steve Reese. I'm the owner of Reese Law Firm, and we focus our practice on several areas, but most applicable to conversation today, we do a lot of business law work.
Yeah. So for those of you who are tuning in the first time, welcome to the Binary Business Show. We talk about tech, we talk about business, we talk about life, and we talk about all the areas those places intersect. And we'll go into the main topic in a few minutes here. Before we go there, Steve, I want to ask you, any Thanksgiving plans? Right around the corner, man.
Yeah, just a couple of days, I'm going to be heading out of town. Actually, my brother and his wife live in Arkansas, and my
Oh,
parents
wow.
are they live in Florida, and so we're converging on Arkansas. We're gonna um, raid the fort there and have a nice Thanksgiving with as much of the family as we can get together.
I'm gonna say this knowing that my in-laws are probably watching, which is funny, or they'll probably listen at some point. I think it's always better to go to the in-laws' house than have them come to my house. Like now I'm their problem, not the other way around. Man,
Yeah.
I thought honestly you were going to tell me you were going to drive from Arkansas to Florida. That's what I thought you were going with that, and I'm like, oh my, that's a very busy Thanksgiving.
No, we're driving from here to Arkansas, which is about 11 half hour drive, and then my parents are driving north, and so we're gonna converge in Arkansas.
Oh, all right. I usually end up splitting Thanksgiving myself with my family, with my parents during the morning and my in-laws in the afternoon. Sometimes that gets reversed, but they're not nearly as far as Arkansas. They just live about 30 minutes south of us, so my day's going to be way easier, I think, than that. Are you driving or flying?
Driving.
Oof! Don't you have little kids?
Yeah, three of them.
Oh boy, you're gonna have a fun road trip there. What's Arkansas? About a 7 hour drive?
It's about 11 hours.
About 11 hours from Columbus? Oof. All right.
Yep.
Well, Steve, let's go ahead and dive in today. So the big topic the last 2 weeks really in my sphere, and I would love to have your insight on this. Now, before we go any further, let's put a general disclaimer out of here. We're in the realm of conjecture. This is not legal advice. This is not any kind of advisement of how you should run your business or make business decisions on, because we don't know how this is going to shake out, nor in your case, are you acting as our audience's attorney. So we'll put that disclaimer right up front. However, I am interested to see, as an attorney, sort of your take on what's going on here. So, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, we're going to be referencing an article today out of Reuters, and I can't share my screen because Reuters has the big ad block, but I'll summarize it real quick, which is, long story short, Reuters posted an article on the SEC investigating in the SolarWinds. Now, let's back up before we go into what the SEC's investigation has unveiled. About 3 years ago, SolarWinds, big company, sold lots of high-end equipment and software. They made a product called Orion, which allowed big government organizations, big businesses to manage their networks centrally. Because you might have 6,000 routers, you might have 5,000 network switches. That's a lot of manpower to manage all that equipment. What these tools did was give you centralized controls and ways of managing them effectively at scale. So this tool was very popular. It was used in all kinds of places, including in the federal government and many departments. Well, 2020 hits. Man, 2020 was a bad year just across the board, but this is just another one in its books. We find out the company that made Orion, SolarWinds, got majorly hacked. And their software, their tool Orion, was used to steal data. What data and how much, we're not 100% certain to this day. It was used to steal data from Fortune 500 companies, federal government, DoD contractors, military institutions. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It was a huge deal, not just for civilian population, but for national security. Bad news. Well, fast forward to 2023, SolarWinds, SEC has been investigating this apparently quietly for the last 3 years, and they came out with bombshell allegations. Like this is throwing for the SEC. This is the nuclear option, in my opinion. They did. They said SolarWinds, you hid material cyber risk from your investors that you should have known about, and we're not only holding you accountable, we're holding your chief information security officer, your CISO, accountable, and we're alleging fraud, civilly, but alleging fraud. So coming after an individual executive, and I'm going to stop there. What was your take on that when you read that article and read sort of the SEC's allegations?
Yeah, I thought it was very intriguing and as a lawyer, terrifying that they were so quickly going after the some of the C-suite and
Yeah.
officers. It's one thing to hold a company. Fraud's a not an easy thing to prove. It's a fairly high threshold that you have to cross, and so it's not it's not uncommon to have a fraud claim made against a company, but to see it trickle down so quickly to the officers, that was what was striking to me.
Yeah, I mean, individual officers, if you've ever worked at the enterprise level, hiring quality candidates to run those C-level positions can be a real challenge, especially with the kind of turnover we're talking in corporate world. Um, it does change the game, I think, because one of the things we talk a lot on the show is how cyber risk is so ubiquitous. There's just no real good way to avoid it. It's impossible to avoid 100%. Sooner or later, someone's going to take a swipe at you. It's just that's part of living in 2023. So you're saying because we were hit, the CISO in this case held to that fraud standard. But we know that every company is going to get hit sooner or later in some way, shape, or form. And how they will handle it depends on a lot of different factors, not all of which is in their control. How are you supposed to have confidence in someone going into that position that you're not going to end up in court 3, 4, 5 years later defending yourself personally against an organization as powerful as the SEC? That for me on the security side, that's going to be heavy in my mind. If anyone came to me and said, "I want you to be the CISO for my big enterprise company," I'd be going, "Well, hold on a second. That sounds great on the surface, but I don't want to be in court in 5 years."
Yeah, I think there's concerns about what's it going to do to talent and people, like you said, people maybe not wanting to take that position. I think the key you got to come down to is obviously the major thing that has to be determined was there actual fraudulent activity. If there wasn't, that's a good defense to it. But if there was fraudulent activity going on by individuals, that the fact that it is coming to them directly so quickly is really unnerving for folks in the industry.
Well, and that's the kind of the thing, right? Like, so let's talk a couple things and from a corporate perspective. So the officer that they're charging, the chief information security officer, this isn't always the case, but traditionally speaking, they are not that top level C position, right? Like they're, I'd say more equivalent to maybe a VP. Like you've got the CIO, the CFO, the COO, with the CEO above them, and then reporting to the CIO, the CTO, the COO is the CISO. So two layers down. Generally, the CISO at the end of the day reports to that C-level suite, and they will do, even whether or not they want to, whatever the people above them tell them to. Right? Like it is a mid-management job in a lot of ways. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that personally. From a governance culture standpoint, I think we're moving into a world where a CISO should be equivalent to the CIO because those two are often going to have very direct and competing interests, and probably somewhere in the middle is the right way for the company to go. But that's a whole other topic. Um, I talked to the CISO actually recently. So someone who's in the CISO for a fairly large organization, you know what he told me? He is mandating for now, and this is his personal risk mitigation, that any of his employment contracts that his employer indemnify him. Meaning when he's not taking any positions unless his employer agrees to blanket indemnify him for any actions he did for them during the job role. Because like that risk is becoming more and more real. What do you think about that?
I think we're going to probably see more of that, Logan.
So what is indemnification for those of you who might not be familiar with that term? Go ahead, Mr. Attorney, sir. Can you elaborate what indemnification is?
Sure, absolutely. Indemnification is simply another person, or in this case, an organization, telling another person or an organization that they will indemnify, that they will hold them harmless should any action be brought against them. In other words, if let's say I'm agreeing to indemnify you, Logan, I would be saying if you get sued, I'm going to hold you harmless. I will step into the lawsuit and I will take responsibility. I will take responsibility for, the litigation, for any consequences that come from it, all of those different um, what spill-offs that come from
Yeah,
litigation.
the
You're
miscellaneous
stepping in and
costs
taking that
and everything. Yeah.
responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that's probably going to be the main way this no matter how this shakes out, the precedent's been opened at this point, right? Like there's precedent now, and everyone who's going into those level of positions, I think that's just a dummy thing they're going to have to do, right? Like I can't work for you unless you agree. If this comes down the pipeline to indemnify me, pay my legal costs, fight my battle for me, because as an individual, I work enough with regulatory stuff and compliancy as a service to know that some of the bigger agencies, they can absolutely pummel a business into the ground if they throw their weight behind it. But not they shouldn't, and very rarely do they choose to exercise that option. But SEC's got a lot of clout and can absolutely drag things out from just a sheer tactical standpoint. I'm not talking about should they or will they or whatever, just from a sheer can they do it capability. Yes, they can. So as an individual, that kind of terrifies me because I don't have a budget for 200 legal hours at $400 an hour as a person. Like that's just not going to happen. Like that alone is just no, right?
And that bleed out that you get is as old as the practice of law, unfortunately. And there are things that the practice has in there as guide rails to try to prevent that, what we would call frivolous litigation and things that are unnecessarily increasing the financial cost on people. But the reality is, at the end of the day, the big companies or the big organizations like the SEC have the ability to just bleed dry an individual, even if it's a highly compensated individual,
Yeah.
that the legal fees just become unattainable, able to be continued. It's unsurmountable.
So I didn't tell you about this, and I apologize to the audience again. I don't have an article ready, but I was reading that the SolarWinds did a response to the SEC. I don't know if you read about that, but SolarWinds did respond to the SEC's allegation. So there was sort of some conjecture behind closed doors. Nothing that I would go on the record and say, obviously alleged, that maybe maybe the SEC is just trying to highlight an issue, make a very prominent case in the papers to kind of put other companies on notice. Hey, we're watching. And they met with SolarWinds behind closed doors and potential preemptively discussing settlements, right? Like that was sort of like the conjecture. Then SolarWinds responded. And in SolarWinds, I saw the response. I saw the words incompetence. I saw the words negligent. I saw the words all directed at the SEC. Like SolarWinds came out swimming and basically said the SEC is lying. They are mixing terms. They are pulling facts from different things that aren't relevant to this case to make a story that doesn't fit anything in the narrative. So that was intriguing to me because that tells me if there was any kind of potential settlement brewing, it's dead. I mean, on one hand, I'm glad the SolarWinds came out swinging, right? Like they obviously are protecting, as we talked about, the CISO that's being charged with them, right? That they're stepping up to the plate because I think they recognize the chilling effect this will have on talent in the industry if they don't. And at the end of the day, businesses live and die by their talent. Whether big or small, you have to have talented individuals running certain positions. But that also kind of puts me in my head, and I'm curious your take on this. 98% of all litigations usually settled out of court. With them taking such big postures in the beginning, I see a very realistic chance this goes through all the way to trial. What do you think?
That's highly likely, especially with everyone posturing so aggressively at this point. There's a good likelihood that this could go all the way to trial, and like you said, almost all litigation is resolved short of trial. However, there are certain circumstances when either someone's trying to make a point or out of principle. Usually it comes down to one of those two, where someone's going to dig in on the one side of the litigation and say, we're not going to roll over and play dead. And usually the settlement numbers come down if we're looking at purely numeric issues.
And to be clear, the SEC can only pursue civil charges, right? Like they're not a criminal organization, or they can't do criminal charges, to my knowledge. Is that my working knowledge correct?
I believe you're correct on that. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So okay, go ahead.
Now they could probably make a criminal referral if they found a criminal activity, but I don't think the SEC themselves would be pursuing criminal unless it was something like,
Maybe like a joint thing with
um,
the FTC or something like that, like a joint,
yeah,
yeah, something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
pretty unlikely that you would see that. But usually it's dollars and cents that drive the settlement. You've got and maybe you can shed a little more light on this, Logan. If is there a large fine being levied in this
Yeah,
case?
so the SEC, and again, I am not the lawyer in this conversation, so this is a non-lawyer's perspective, has been making moves to show enforcement in this field. They are actually putting up a new regulation. I forget the actual name of the law, but it revolves around something called filing a Form 8K for publicly traded companies that starts next month. Basically, nutshell, go, obviously not a lawyer, disclaimer, go talk to your legal counsel for full advisement on this new proceedings and legal actions. But the long and short of it is, if you have a cybersecurity incident that's considered material, whatever that word means, you have 4 days to file a public form called a Form 8K with the Security Exchange Commission, which is a public statement acknowledging what happened, why was it material, roughly who did it. That is an incredibly short time frame in my world for figuring out, the full scope of what happened. Usually, when we do like incident response or forensics, we're talking timelines of 20 to 30 days, just if we bust our hump to figure out what the heck happened fully, reasonably with all assurance, like this is what we believe happened and this is why, right? With all the evidence backing it up. Can I make a conjecture before then? Sure, but I want to have the evidence to back that up. 4 days, that's really aggressive. So they've made that move already before all this came out, and now we see this. So it does seem like that's where they're heading.
Yeah, and maybe the some of the digging in is like you said, the company trying to protect its talent, because if it's a purely numbers game, I can tell you that 9 times out of 10, 98 times out of 100, it's going to get settled. But if we're talking about company or a organization like the SEC setting precedent of holding people at the mid-level accountable, we may be seeing that pushback just because they're trying to protect their people and out of principle fight back.
Yeah, and principle and also cost, right? Like now they're gonna have every single executive walk in the door and say that exact thing, right? Like you need to indemnify me, protect me, and now that's two legal fights they're fighting, the one for them and the one for their employee. Like this is a snowball effect. The moment you open that door, there's no going back. I think is the way they're viewing this. Um, it's kind of curious. The most apt thing I can think of at the top of my head is financial fraud. Like obviously we have clear precedents of how if a C-level executive operates, in gross negligence for fraud, the SEC absolutely can bring charges, civil charges, and the FTC can get involved, and all of the DOJ and all those things, right, for publicly traded companies. But the thing about financial fraud and running that risk is, as long as you're doing best efforts, due diligence, like that's a very minute, minuscule risk. Like
Mm-hmm.
it really is reserved for the bad actors. Something like this, like what they're alleging, like the SEC was being negligent on the amount of proactive measures it was taking and disclosures it was taking to its investors regarding cyber risk. I mean, cyber risk changes year to year on what's defined in that. Like, look where we are now in 2023 versus 2020 when COVID happened, right? How the world's changed. We went from seeing, oh, cybercrime is annoying pop-ups on my computer to, hey, there's no more gasoline in the southern states because all the fuel foundries were shut down, right? Like that was just in the last 4 years that really came publicly attention. So how do you sort of mitigate that risk? I just don't see a way you can, but not in a way that's going to like meaningful put this risk column to a near zero. That's my take on that.
I think you're right. I think that somebody's going to end up bearing that risk, and it's going to probably end up being the companies, because the average person, and not that a company can afford the expensive legal fights, but like we talked about earlier, the average person certainly can't. And if they refuse to take a job without indemnification, we're back to the company absorbing all this. And unless they can have some kind of fee shifting structure that allows, if the SEC is being unduly burdensome, they can allow some kind of fee shifting, which is not the normal way things are done.
No.
I see this as probably landing on the company's shoulders and being a burden that they pass on.
And that's actually kind of my worry too. I mean, the Biden administration this year announced an exploratory committee to look at this problem because obviously it's not going anywhere and it's getting worse year by year. Like, how do we restructure our legal process, our country's strategy? And one of the things that was kind of proposed was, put the burden on the companies instead of the individuals, which is great until you think about, oh gosh, what any company could bear this entire burden. Like, if it's centralized on, the answer is none. Like, most of them revolve on insurance or rely on insurance in a lot of ways. Well, the insurance industry, and we talk about that on this show too. Um, I'm not a licensed agent. I'm not a licensed risk advisor in the insurance space. This is just my 2 cents. So disclaimer. But the insurance industry is really just trying to figure out how to even mitigate this kind of risk. It's the best I've heard. I've talked to several carriers. They look at like flood insurance. Like, you don't know when it's going to hit. You don't know how bad it's going to be. You know that everybody, depending on where they're at in the industry, is going to get hit somehow. So you just do your best. And if you've ever done flood insurance, like any agent, they'll tell you, it's all heavily regulated. There's like two main carriers that can do it. It's a pain in the rear. The rates are always super high. And what it'll cover is very, very much down to the fine print of your contract. Like, it's like, we will cover this kind of portion of damage on this wall, but not this wall. Like, that's a lot of the feedback I hear from agents that sell those policies. Like, they hate selling those policies because they're so restrictive and tight, and they're a blunt instrument where a scalpel is needed, is the way I hear it a lot. And so I don't think any, if you add the fact that, most errors and emissions policies in my industry, like tech policies, errors and emissions, a director's policies, they do usually include clauses that say we'll protect you in the event of regulatory fines and lawsuits. It's just another thing I don't think that the market's ready to bear.
Mm-hmm.
But so implication wise too, let's talk broader. Let's move beyond the SEC for a second. We definitely are seeing on my side of the house, on the tech side, more moves by powers that be, whether on the state level, the local level, and the federal level, making overall shifts to the business sector as a whole. No matter what industry you're in, you need to do bare minimum. Like, they're basically removing that line of what they considered gross negligence before, and they're shifting it up to a more realistic line. That's what I'm seeing. Um, Tell me about your business law, right? Cyber stuff. What's your exposure to that, and sort of like what kind of, obviously we've worked together. Probably should disclose in the show, Steve acts as our counsel. So there are certain things he is not going to say on the show and his experience, but the stuff that isn't about us and that you can talk about generically. Have you had any exposure in that area? Or like,
Yeah, the tech industry is really a from a legal standpoint, a tough industry to work in, just because, like you said, there's so much that's always changing. The regulatory climate's change. The organizations like the SEC are always, even with different administrations, are going to have a different personality to them. And so it's a challenging area. And what I found is there are certain firms that tend to focus on tech law, and that's not, we don't exclusively focus on that, but there are some firms that they focus on preparing all the disclaimers you need for your websites and all the privacy policies and in the cyber law
data
and
processing policies? Yeah.
unfortunately the it for a lot of your listeners, those firms tend to be exceptionally expensive. The any law, anyone's going to tell you that a lawyer is expensive, but IT type lawyers are just even more expensive than normal, and so it's becoming a very specialized niche, and that is in turn causing prices to go up quite significantly.
Yeah, I actually have been seeing on the other side of this too, from my perspective, more and more counsel getting involved on individual suit levels for this kind of stuff too. Like, I have been seeing advertisements through various YouTube channels and things like that. Have you been impacted by, some kind of data breach? Reach out to us because there is insurance money if you know how to twist the law in your favor. And so I don't want to say ambulance chaser style because it's not quite there yet, but it definitely feels like it's heading in that direction where like the legal sphere knows that this is. Sorry, I dropped off for a second. Where'd I get cut off at?
You're saying that the legal sphere notices that this is
It's like a game of whack-a-mole. Like it's almost impossible to figure out how to cover yourself adequately at all times. Like you're eventually going to make a mistake. You're eventually going to have some section of I should have done something differently, and that just opens you up to a can of worms when it comes to litigation. That's been my take on that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the how broad this is getting and the number of exponential increase in cyber crime is just making this the ability to, like you said, you take care of this issue and a new one pops up. And that is a very hard way to operate your business when you're always trying to tamp down the next crisis that pops up.
I don't know where this ends. And I think that's anybody who's being honest with themselves has no idea where this ends up, right? Like this is just such a fluid thing and the world keeps changing so rapidly. If anybody says this is how things are going to be for the next 20 years in this space, they are lying through their teeth. Like I don't think anybody can make that call. That being said, legally speaking, and again, I understand not legal counsel, not legal advice, but generally broadly speaking, I'm starting to think to customers if they do business with data, they need to start thinking about their own protection from their own contracts, terms and conditions. Like you need to put some indemnification or at least some negligence language in your contracts or terms and conditions that define the scope of what you're liable, if anything, you're liable for. That seems to be the way this needs to go, and not because you don't want to be responsible or ethical, but because you don't know what's going to happen down the road, and you've got to take some basic mitigation measures. Would you agree with that or disagree with that?
Wholeheartedly. I think that you're hitting the nail right on the head, Logan, when you talk about all so much of the practice of law and insurance is about mitigating risk. Those are we're trying to look at what can we do for our clients to minimize the chance that they get whacked with a big SEC lawsuit or something like that. And it's never going to be able to be stamped out completely. But if we can pass on some of that liability to somebody else, or at least
At least
corral it in.
yeah, we call it limiting the blast radius in my world, like limiting
Yeah.
the blast radius, right? Like we know what we can prevent and kind of like prepare for, and we got to contain it to those rounds because otherwise we don't know what we're gonna get hit with. Is that okay? Um,
100%, because if you just leave it wide open, it's so broad. Like you said, you're going to get hit at some point, and if you don't corral that down a little bit, you're gonna just it's going to go beyond your ability to control it. And then once you're getting hit with fines and suits over things that are beyond what you can even influence, that's a pretty horrible place to be.
yeah, and unfortunately, with such a rapidly dynamic, and I think I'll end on this note for our conversation today. But I think with such a rapidly evolving environment, right? Like how keeps changing and shifting. I don't necessarily understand if know if new legislation or rules are going to be able to keep up with this because the wheels of government, even when they're done properly, are always turn slowly, and this thing literally changes year to year. So I don't know what meaningful change from top down government looks like in this. Like I'm not going to politics here and saying I like big government or not. No, I'm saying I'm just trying to figure out from a tactical standpoint what meaningful changes can we make to make a difference on this? And I don't, we just kind of conjecture today, like who can bear this risk? The answer is nobody. And also, too, this risk might be completely different in 2 years. We know it just keeps getting, one thing we know consistently is it seems to keep getting worse. That's really all we know. Is the only thing that seems to be consistent is it keeps getting worse. So I applaud like people who want to take a step up and make a difference, but I don't know if I agree with how the SEC is going about this. Holding the messenger, it feels like shooting the messenger to me. It really does. It feels like you're shooting the messenger, especially with the CISO being traditionally we talked about, sort of the mid management, right? Like at the end of the day, he's not making any unilateral judgment calls by himself. Like that's just not how that works, and especially in big corporate culture.
And that's the most disturbing part, I think, is the fact that they're that mid management. It's not like they're at the top of the food chain making these decisions themselves.
I would have expected them to go after the CEO if that's the case. Like if they want to go where the buck stops, like hold the CEO accountable. But even then, that would make sense because the CEO doesn't run day to day on that stuff. So, like, I think it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. What I'm getting a lot from the community is it seems like the SEC just wants a scalp. and they're willing to play it a little fast and loose to get it. That seems to be the conjectured hypothesis at the moment. We'll just have to see, I guess. We'll have to see. Real quick, let me go ahead and make a quick shout out for those of you who are listening to this and thinking, what the heck am I supposed to do about this? Fair question. Seriously, fair question. There are things you can proactively do to manage risk in this sphere. If you want to learn more or just have a conversation about what applies to you and what doesn't from a risk standpoint, I have a QR code here in the top left-hand corner of our video. It takes you to a calendar page. It is for a free, no commitment, no hassle, no strings attached, 15-minute cyber strategy session. Now, I am here for the tactical portion of things. From the legal side of things, my friend Steve here is a much better resource. Steve, if someone would like to reach out to you, learn more about their legal options, maybe in this kind of realm of sphere, how would they get a hold of you?
Probably the best way to just be to shoot me an email. My email address is my first name, Steve, at my last name, Reese, which is spelled like the peanut butter cups, Reese.
Right here on the screen. You got your little thing right here on the screen.
You're right. I forgot I was on there. And then instead of .com, it's .legal. That's what tripped you up at the beginning of this.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Well, Steve, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm hoping to have you back on as the situation develops. Maybe we can see where this goes, because at this point, I feel like what's the meme? Have you ever seen the meme of the dog with the coffee cup in the burning room going, "This is fine"? You ever seen that?
I don't think I have.
It's a really funny one. It's just this cartoon dog sitting in a burning room, sipping a cup of coffee, takes a sip of coffee and goes, "This is fine." I really feel like I'm that dog right now. Like, everything's burning. All I can do is just sit back and watch and comment as it goes on. So I'm hoping to sit back and watch with you, if that's all right, in future episodes.
Absolutely. That sounds great.
Thanks, everybody. Happy Turkey Day if you're watching this beforehand.